We want to change here now to something that I think everything we've been talking about here today is deeply embedded in that sort of the shifting sands of the world order, and in particular, the role of Africa and the way the world is changing, and let's hope changing for the better. And I think based on what happens in Africa will determine a lot of that. We are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Roger McKenzie, who's the international editor of the Morning Star newspaper, but more importantly, the author of the new book, The Rebirth of the African Phoenix, A View from Babylon. It's got a great name in and of itself, but it's a great book. Roger, thanks so much for being back with us.
So glad to be on again. Hope you're all well.
As good as can be expected in this moment, and honored to have you with us. And, the book is timely for many reasons, but to me, it's timely this week because obviously there will be the big celebration in Moscow tomorrow for Victory Day. And the thing that everyone is talking about is that Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who's the head of the transitional government of Burkina Faso, one of the three leaders of the Alliance for Sahel States, is there in Moscow. He's going to be there. There's a picture rocketing around the world right now of him shaking hands with Maduro. They met today. Maduro's also there for this. But I think it speaks so much to the title of your book, The Rebirth of an African Phoenix. And I want you to talk about that. Why do you think it is that it was so electrifying for people to hear that Ibrahim Traoré would be standing with these other world leaders like, Chairman Xi from China, President Lula from Brazil, the people who we know, like his presence? Burkina Faso is not a country people necessarily think of in the same way of Brazil and China, but in many ways, his name after Xi has been the most spoken of name in terms of attendees.
He's under fire. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen the captain, interim president. We've seen how there's been this plot against him, where they plotted to assassinate him and to overturn what's been going on in Burkina Faso. And we've seen, and this is really important, and kind of some of the things that I cover in the book, is how this isn't just some small, isolated internal thing. This is yet again how Western imperial powers are intervening in Africa, and using other African leaders, other African countries, to try and undermine what's going on. This is a time, and I talk about this extensively in the book, where we really have to get behind this shift that's taking place in Africa, and why it's so important that the interim president is in Moscow right now. Yeah, this really feels like a kind of almost like a Bandung moment, where you've got this gathering of all of these global majority countries who are turning up in Moscow and are saying, you know what, this is a statement from us about what we believe in, and that it's time for something new. So all of these nations, despite the threats that are being made by against some of them, even the Serbian prime minister was threatened by the European Union. If you dare to go to Moscow and dare to celebrate Victory Day in Moscow, we will somehow sanction you. This is ludicrous. This is all going on at a time when European Union and many other countries are undermining the role that the Soviet Union played in the victory over the Nazis, where they're being wiped out of monuments that are placed right the way across Europe. And Eugene, that's why it's important that we understand that the statement that is being made by anybody who goes to Moscow is that we are not playing that game anymore. What we are about is building a new multilateral world. And that's really what I talk about in the book, frankly. But in reality, this is what's being played out in Moscow right now. It's a massive statement that's being made. The interim president of Burkina Faso is right at the heart of that. It's an inspirational figure.
Well, talk more about that, because when it comes to your book, the rebirth of the African Phoenix, you talk about Africa's emergence from these colonial legacies. So contextualize Traoré's foreign policy, like expelling French troops, and then of course aligning with Russia. How does that reflect that sort of past, and then perhaps this broader movement in various parts of Africa towards self-determination?
Well, I think when you start with the Sahel region, I think that's a great place really to start. And when you look at the way that the whole thing that's happening with the Alliance of Sahel Nations is being portrayed across the world, all you hear about it, and I'm a journalist, so all I get is I see all the wires and the way that they're being portrayed. It's a military regime, and it's a coup, and these are all nasty, horrible people. What I said to somebody last week, I think, is really, really important. You know, we support Cuba. Cuba was liberated at the point of a gun, frankly. And many other nations across the colonial world were freed because people were prepared to stand up and do something about that. What we're seeing in the Sahel nations right now, I think, should be an inspiration to people who want to see something different across Africa, but who are fed up with this constant kind of bullying and the constant kind of exploitation of Africa by the Western nations, led, of course, by the United States. So what I talk about in the book is in one of the chapters, I give some examples of where that has taken place. So, for example, Libya is one example, and the way that the NATO nations, again led by the United States, attacked and have divided Libya. And this is the kind of game plan that they have. For the rest of Africa, they want to divide and rule. And we see it in other parts of Africa, the role that the United States continues to play in through their acolytes in places like Sudan and in places like Congo. That quite often now across Africa, they're not doing this straight up front themselves. They've got their playmates, they've got their people who are doing this on their behalf. And what I see right now taking place is a real shift. Because if you were looking at this kind of 10 years ago, then there wouldn't have been the confidence that it was possible, I think, to stand up and do something against what the United States and their posse are trying to do right now. What we're seeing is people, because I think of the role that's played by China and the role that's played by Russia, in particular, those two nations, people have the confidence that they have some cover, that they're going to be able to help to create something different. And the language of this, Rania, is really, really important, that we look at this as multilateral, that we're not looking at creating another pole somehow, but what we're saying is that this is an opportunity for real sovereignty to be exercised by Africa. And let's face it, we haven't had a real sovereignty across Africa for 400, 500 years. This is a breakout moment for Africa. So I try to kind of illustrate that within the book. But I think much more important than what I think is a really good book and everybody should buy my book and all the rest of it is what is taking place right now. People are doing this in real life, and that's the importance of what's taking place in Moscow. But people are doing this in the Sahel region, and they're trying to do it elsewhere. And what's going on in the Sahel will give people the confidence to get rid of some of these misleaders that occupy the spaces within many places in Africa, because they are a real obstacle and they must be removed if there's going to be any prospect of real success. But once they've done that, there's a real opportunity to be able to take on the United States and the Western powers, the other Western powers as well.
No, absolutely. People should buy the book. It's a great price too. You're helping the working class out there. 17 pounds roughly. It's worth much more, but I appreciate that. But speaking of the working class, you yourself are a trade unionist. You were once the assistant general secretary of Unison, I believe. And you talk a little bit in the book about the role of workers' movements in Africa, which is a very unique terrain because the informal sector has become so significant. So talk, if you could, about, the need for and maybe some of the innovations that need to be made to really start to bring the trade union fight, into the forefront of the broader struggle here for Africa's rebirth?
One of the legacies, I guess, of the way that the colonial powers have operated is that they have informalized a lot of the labor market across Africa. So a couple of years ago, and again, I write about this in the book, I was in Kenya, and I thought I knew about a lot of this stuff, but I was talking to trade unionists in Nairobi, and they were telling me that 90% of the economy across the whole of Kenya is informal. So if we're trade unionists, how do you organize? How do you try and develop some sense of collective organization when it's all completely atomized, when people are on their own and people are just really being put in a position quite deliberately by the Western powers of just thinking, I just need to make sure that I can put a roof over my head and the head of my and the roof and a roof over the head of my family and put bread on the table of my family. So it's very individualistic, very deliberately, because it breaks down collective strength, breaks down collective organization. That's entirely deliberate. But African trade unionists are trying to deal with some of this stuff as well. So in places like Kenya, I saw the Metal Workers Union looking at the way that car repair workers were operating on one particular compound within Nairobi. And what they did was they created a sort of cooperative, and we're offering the help of the union to get training for those folks, because of course one of the industries that's going to develop within Kenya is the car industry. So if people are able to get training, are able to develop the skills that they've develop themselves informally but more formalize and get qualifications within those industries, they're going to be in a better position to be in more formalized industries. So this is a way of trade unions who are trying to find a way of organizing those informal workers, and I think that's really important, that we just show some imagination. And frankly, one of the things that we've always done as people of African descent, again, I do write about this in the book, is we've had to be imaginative. We've had to be find ways of being, to break down the barriers that have been put in front of us so that we can develop, well, first of all, so that we could survive, first of all, but secondly, so that we could find ways of developing. One thing I'll say about Africa as well, Eugene, is that what we saw William Ruto, who I think there's major problems with Ruto as a politician, and some of the things that he's doing in terms of repressing the progressive movements within Kenya. But even he, I think, has understood the pressure that he's under within Kenya. And I think in the last 2 weeks, we saw him in China, in Beijing, making really clear that he's understood the need to pivot towards a much closer relationship with China, and by definition as well, I think at the moment with Moscow as well. That's huge, given the fact that he's been a real lackey of the West in recent times. So I think there's progress that's being made, but certainly from the trade union movement, I see a lot of trade unionists who are trying to be imaginative, who are looking at ways of doing things differently. And I think that's just so important because of the legacy of colonialism, frankly.
Roger, this is so important. We could talk all day here. Unfortunately, we don't have all day, but it's an ongoing conversation. And I think your book, The Rebirth of the African Phoenix, A View from Babylon, great part of that conversation. African Uhuru, your book that just came right before this, also fantastic. I know it's in a continuum. I appreciate you putting all this out there. Once again, the island of Jamaica becoming the great spokesperson for the entire African diaspora. Roger McKenzie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.